I have taken apart more fishing reels on this bench than most people will own in 3 lifetimes. $18, $300, doesn't matter. The screws come out, the side plate comes off, and the truth spills onto the towel. The truth is this: most of what you paid for is sitting on the box, not inside the housing. Pop the cover off a $300 reel and a $35 reel side by side, and a lot of the time you're looking at the same brass pinion, the same stamped frame geometry, the same drag stack with a different sticker. The expensive one has a few grams shaved here, a tighter tolerance there. But the parts that actually fight the fish, cousins, sometimes twins, this is forbidden lures. Today I'm putting 10 reels on the bench that tournament pros and working guides quietly keep on their backup rods and their clients' rigs, every one of them under 50 bucks. And I'm going to show you what's screwed down underneath the marketing, because that's the part the industry would rather you never see. The factory floor. Let me start with where these things are actually born, because once you know this, you can't unknow it. There's a city in eastern China called Weihai in Shandong province. If you've ever bought a fishing rod, odds are it came from there. Weihai builds close to 60% of the world's fishing rods, and China as a whole turns out more than 80% of all the fishing tackle on the planet. Thousands of factories clustered together, the full chain under one roof, raw material refiners feeding component shops, feeding assembly lines, feeding the boxes that end up on your tackle shop wall. Here's the part that matters when you're standing at the register. When a city makes that much of one thing, the cost per unit collapses. Picture a town where every third building is a die casting shop, molten zinc and aluminum poured into precision molds at a scale so large the price per reel drops into the single digits at the factory gate. So when a reel rings up at $300, understand what you're paying for. Not triple the metal. You're paying for the distributor, the retail markup, the magazine spread, and the pro angler with your reel's logo on his jersey. The hardware is a fraction of the ticket. The story wrapped around it is the rest. Now, the industry knows you can't see inside the box at the store, so they invented a number to fill the gap, and it's a lie. Once I show you this one, you'll never get fooled at the counter again. The bearing count lie flip over almost any budget reel, and you'll see it stamped right on the front: 10 plus 1 bearings, 11 bearings. Sounds premium, sounds smooth. It's the single most effective trick in the business, and it's almost meaningless. Here's what nobody at the counter will tell you. A ball bearing is only as good as the thing holding it in place. Imagine bolting a perfectly machined hinge onto a flimsy cardboard door. The hinge is flawless. The door still flexes and binds the second you lean on it. That's exactly what happens when you stuff a fistful of cheap steel bearings into a soft, flexible graphite frame. On the showroom floor with no load on it, that 11-bearing reel spins like silk. You crank the handle, it feels expensive, you buy it. Then a reel fish loads the rod, the frame flexes a hair, every one of those bearings shifts out of alignment at once, and the gear teeth start grinding themselves to powder. I've seen the shavings on my bench to prove it. What actually makes a reel smooth and durable is boring to put on a box. Frame rigidity, gear alignment, metallurgy of the pinion and drive gear. A 3+1 bearing count inside a stiff, well-braced frame will outlive and outfish a wobbly 11-bearing reel every day of the week. So from here on, when I call out a bearing number, watch what I say about the frame around it. That's the tell. Let's get to the bench. Counting down from 10. 10. Okuma Aria A, the $20 honest reel number 10. The Okuma Aria A, around $20, the cost of 2 sandwiches, and yet I'd hand this to a kid on their first rod without a second thought. Okuma built the body and side plates out of corrosion-resistant graphite, and the rotor is what they call a cyclonic flow rotor. Forget the name a second. Here's the idea in plain English. Picture the vents on a car's brake rotor, the little holes that let air move through and carry heat away. Okuma drilled that same logic into the spinning part of this reel. When your gear gets splashed and soaked all day, those ports let air move through and dry the inside faster, so rust doesn't get a chance to set up shop in the gear housing. On a $20 reel, that's a feature you usually pay 10 times more to get anyone to even think about. The drag is an oiled felt stack, and it gives upline smooth with almost no initial grab, exactly what you want when a fish makes its first lunge. Inside, a machine-cut brass pinion does the work. If you need to rig 5 rods for the family and want everyone to actually function, this is the honest answer. Nobody's getting rich selling you this reel, which is probably why you've never seen it in a commercial. The next one is the reel guides quietly hand to clients when they don't want to risk their good gear. 9. Casking Centron. The guide's loaner number 9, the Casking Centron, somewhere between 25 and 30 bucks. A name worth knowing. KastKing came straight out of the Weihai ecosystem and sells direct to you, skipping the middlemen who add the markup. Factory pricing, more or less, mailed to your door. The frame is a narrow, high-density graphite composite, which keeps the weight off your wrist on a long day. KastKing rates the drag at up to 17.5 pounds from a greased felt washer stack. I always tell you to treat a manufacturer's drag number like a manufacturer's number, meaning it's measured in a lab and your reel won't quite hit it, but even at 3/4 of that figure, this thing will turn a serious fish. What I actually like when I open it up is the gear train, a hardened metal main shaft, a machined brass pinion, a zinc alloy drive gear, all meshing without the sloppy play you'd expect at this price. For a guide throwing finesse plastics all day on a client rod, this is the loaner you don't cry over if it goes overboard. The pros aren't hiding these because they're embarrassed. They're hiding them because they work. And the next one works in a way the bass-flipping crowd really doesn't want spread around. 8. Abu Garcia Max X, the low-profile mule number 8, is for my Baitcaster crowd. The Abu Garcia Max X, right around $45, and it punches so far above its weight it's almost rude. When you're pitching a jig into heavy cover and you set the hook on a fish trying to bury you in the lily pads, you need raw cranking torque and a frame that won't twist. The Max X is built on a one-piece graphite frame with an asymmetric body, a fancy way of saying it's shaped to sit low in your palm so you can thumb the spool naturally. Abu loaded it with their Duragear brass gearing, a brass gear hardened to resist wear, and on the bench it shrugs off abuse far better than the pot metal you'd fear at this price. The real trick is the brake. The Max X uses a magnetic braking system Abu calls MagTrax. Think of a magnet gently dragging on the spool as it spins, just enough to stop that spool from overspinning and dumping a bird's nest every time you cast. Backed by a synthetic drag rated around 15 pounds, this is a bulletproof backup baitcaster for pennies on the flagship dollar. The pros keep one rigged and ready. The next reel is where one of the biggest names in fishing let their best technology trickle all the way down to the bargain shelf. 7. Shimano Katana Fe, the technology that escaped number 7, the Shimano Katana FE, hovering right around $48. And this one's a quiet scandal because it carries a piece of Shimano's expensive reel DNA right here in the cheap seats. It's called the G-free body. Here's what it does in human terms. On most reels, the heavy guts sit a little farther back. Imagine holding a hammer by the very end of the handle versus choking up near the head. Choked up, it feels light and balanced. Out at the end, your wrist screams after an hour. Shimano shifted the heavy oscillation mechanism inside this reel closer to the rod, closer to your hand, so the whole outfit balances like you're choked up on that hammer. After a 10-hour day of casting, your wrist knows the difference. The spool is a cold-forged aluminum design with an angled lip, and that angle matters if you fish braid. The lip is shaped to let line peel off cleanly instead of slapping and grabbing, which is how you dodge those maddening wind knots that cost you 10 minutes and a lure. Driven by zinc aluminum alloy gears and a 3+1 bearing setup inside a rigid frame, the Katana is a genuinely cheat for drop-shotting bass or drifting for trout. Remember what I said about bearing counts and frames? 3+1 in a stiff body beats 11 in a noodle. This is the reel that proves it. And the next one pushed that light and stiff idea even further. 6. Daiwa Laguna Lieutenant, the featherweight number 6, the Daiwa Laguna LT, coming in just under $50 and built on Daiwa's whole light and tough philosophy, which is what the LT stands for. The body is a carbon composite, and this is where Daiwa earns it. Carbon composite gives you stiffness close to a metal frame, but it shrugs off corrosion and weighs almost nothing. On the bench, you can feel the lack of flex when you torque the handle, and flex is the enemy of everything we just covered about gear alignment. Then there's the rotor. Daiwa hollowed it into an asymmetric shape they call the air rotor, and they claim it drops rotor weight by around 15%. I'll let them own that number, but here's why a lighter rotor matters to you. The rotor is the part that has to start spinning the instant you turn the handle. Lighter rotor, less dead weight to get moving, so the reel comes alive the moment you crank instead of lagging a beat. Inside, Daiwa's Digigear design keeps the teeth meshing cleanly under load. This is a real reel for real money, and the fact that it's under $50 should make a Certate owner a little uncomfortable. Speaking of uncomfortable, the next reel does something the gears on reels 3 times its price routinely fail to do. Quick word before the top 5. Everything I'm tearing down on this bench, the bearing count lie, the frame versus flex test, the drag stack truth, all of it lives in the Forbidden Lures Blueprint, the companion document we build for these videos. It's the laminate it, keep it in the tackle box version, the cheat sheet on what actually matters inside a reel, the upgrade hacks, and the checklist you can run on any reel before you hand over $1. If you'd rather walk into the shop armed than get talked into 11 bearings and a logo, that's where the real ammunition is. Now back to the bench. 5. Piscifun Torrent, the alignment trick top 5. Number 5. The Piscifun Torrent, a baitcaster at around $42 that does the one thing cheap baitcasters almost never get right. Let me explain the problem first. In most reels, the pinion gear, the little gear the spool shaft runs through, is held at one end only. It's like a diving board, anchored on one side, free to bounce on the other. Load a diving board and the free end bounces. Same with a pinion held on one side. Load it with a big fish and it deflects, the gears stop meshing cleanly, and that's when teeth strip. The Torrent supports that pinion at both ends, a bearing on each side. Now it's not a diving board, it's a bridge, braced at both ends, and it barely moves under load. Piscifun cuts the gears from brass for wear resistance, wraps it with a carbon fiber drag rated around 18 pounds, and adds a 5-magnet adjustable brake to keep your casts clean. There's even an oiling port in the side plate for maintenance without a teardown. For $42, they made an engineering choice the expensive reels charge a fortune for. The next reel pointed that same stubbornness at the thing that kills more reels than anything on Earth. 4. Casking Spartacus I, the ergonomic one number 4, the Casking Spartacus II, about $48, and it proves you don't have to fish a heavy, clunky brick just because you're on a budget. It stands only 39 millimeters tall and weighs about 6 ounces. A reel that disappears in your hand. How do you get it that light without it folding under pressure? Casking made the frame from a glass fiber reinforced nylon, exactly what it sounds like. A tough plastic with glass fibers woven through it for stiffness, the same trick used in power tools that get dropped for a living. Then, instead of cheap pot metal gears, they went to 70-75 aluminum, the grade you'll hear called aerospace aluminum, for the main and pinion. The casting feature is the part I'd brag about. It's a line guide Casking calls a double-tapered control chute. Picture a funnel versus a narrow pipe. The funnel lets your line flow through at a gentle angle instead of getting yanked around a sharp corner, so there's less friction and your line flies farther and straighter. Add a 7+1 bearing system in a rigid frame, a carbon drag around 17.5 pounds, and a 5-button magnetic brake, and you've got a reel that fishes like something with a $150 price tag. That brake is no accident, and it leads right into number 3, engineered to survive the single most destructive force in all of fishing. 3. Piscifun Viper X, the salt killer's nightmare number 3, the Piscifun Viper X, around $42, and this one is built for war against saltwater. If you've ever fished inshore, you know the dirty secret of budget reels. Salt gets in, and within a season the reel seizes up like it was filled with sand. The Viper X fights back with a layered defense, easel clutch bushing, a clutch plate, and rubber gaskets, all stacked to keep the brine out of the gear case. Think of the rubber seal around a submarine hatch. Each layer is another door the salt has to break through, and it usually gives up first. The drivetrain is a tank, a zinc alloy drive gear, a reinforced stainless main shaft, 10+1 stainless bearings. And the drag, Piscifun rates the carbon fiber stack at a genuinely wild 33 pounds. That's a published number measured in ideal conditions, so don't expect to feel all 33 in your hand, but even a healthy fraction will stop an inshore redfish or a rogue musky cold. For the price of a couple lures, you get a reel engineered to laugh at the thing that murders budget gear. That brings us to the final 2, where 2 of the biggest names in the world accidentally built their best bargains, starting with a reel you can hot rod in 5 minutes for $15. 2. Shimano Sienna FG, the upgrade secret number 2, the Shimano Sienna FG, about $35, the reel sitting on the shelf of every big box store in America. You've walked past it 100 times. But there's a hack the ice guides and the northern walleye crowd guard like a recipe, and I'm about to hand it to you. Out of the box, the Sienna is built on a composite frame with that cold-forged aluminum spool Shimano uses to fight wind knots, plus an instant anti-reverse so your hook set is rock solid with zero handle play. 3+1 bearings, a stiff frame, the whole honest package for $35. Good reel. But here's the forbidden part. The Sienna comes with a felt drag stack. Felt is fine, but it's the cheap option, and it's the one thing holding this reel back. For about $15, you can buy a drop-in aftermarket carbon fiber drag kit. Pop the spool, pull the felt washers, drop in the carbon washers, reassemble. 5 minutes on the kitchen table, no special tools. Suddenly, your $35 reel has a smoother, higher capacity, heat-resistant drag that performs like a reel costing 4 times as much. Cheap base, smart upgrade, performance the industry would rather sell you as a built-in premium feature. The guides know, now you do. It sets up the number 1 reel perfectly. Because the Champion did that drag upgrade at the factory and still came in at $35. One Daiwa Crossfire Lieutenant, the Champion number 1. The Daiwa Crossfire LT, right around $35, and it's the clearest example I can put on this bench of flagship technology, trickling all the way down to a bargain price. Start with the body. Daiwa builds it on their light and tough composite frame to hold the internals in alignment when a fish surges, and the rotor uses Daiwa's Zion carbon material in the low-inertia design they call air drive, so it spins up the instant you turn the handle. The spool is Daiwa's LCABS design, shaped to let line peel off cleanly for longer, smoother casts and fewer backlashes. Inside, the tough digigear system, oversized precision-cut gears that keep the retrieve smooth season after season. None of that is marketing fog. Those are the same design families Daiwa puts in reels several rungs up the ladder. But the crown jewel is the drag. And here I want to be precise, because the truth is better than the hype. It's Daiwa's ATD Type L, the Advanced Tournament Drag. The honest version. Most cheap drags grab hard the instant a fish pulls, and that initial jolt is what snaps your line on a sudden run. Daiwa's drag uses a proprietary grease engineered, so it starts up smooth and almost grab-free, then settles into steady pressure. So when a trophy fish hits and bolts, the drag feeds line cleanly from the very first inch instead of shocking your line to its breaking point. That's not a gimmick. It's the single most important thing a finesse drag can do, and Daiwa put it on a $35 reel. Now, I'm not going to quote you some heroic field test that never happened, because that's exactly the kind of fairy tale the industry sells. I'll tell you what I know from the bench. Open this reel up and the gear mesh is clean, the rotor is genuinely light, the frame doesn't flex when you load it, and the drag does what Daiwa says it does. For $35, that combination has no business existing. That's why it's number 1. The bottom line, so why are you paying $300 for a reel? Here's the honest answer: because I respect you too much to pretend the expensive ones are scams. They aren't. A flagship Shimano or Daiwa, the saltwater models running $500 to over $1,000, give you genuinely lighter magnesium frames, finer micro gearing, fractions of a second shaved off the startup inertia. Beautiful machines. I love working on them. But here's the truth I keep finding under the side plate. The core functions that actually put fish in the boat, casting distance, smooth line release, steady drag pressure, are fundamentally the same across both price tiers. Those tiny incremental gains on a $300 reel rarely justify the gap. So here's what the smart anglers do, and it's the most forbidden idea of all, because it's the one that costs the industry the most money. Instead of blowing the whole budget on one flagship, they buy 3 or 4 of these sub-50 reels and build technique-specific setups. A dedicated drop shot rod, a flipping stick, a finesse spinning combo, all perfectly tuned for the price of one high-end reel. And one more piece of buried history, because the industry would love you to think this premium game is new. The reel on your spinning rod, the basic fixed-spool design, was patented back in 1905 by a British engineer named Holden Illingworth. It exploded into the mass market in 1948 with a French reel, the Mitchell 300, one of the best-selling reels ever made, sold to working anglers who just wanted to catch fish. The fundamental design hasn't changed. Same machine, mass-produced in Weihai today, wrapped in a price tag that's grown 100 times faster than the engineering inside it. Take the $250 you just saved and put it into gas for the boat, a trip you'll actually remember, or better yet, some seriously forbidden lures. If you want to keep ripping the lid off the tackle industry, exposing the science and the secrets they'd rather keep screwed down under the side plate, hit subscribe and come back next week. Drop your favorite budget reel in the comments and tell me which one you run. Until then, keep your frames rigid and your drags honest. This is Forbidden Lures, and I'm putting the screws back in.